let's say, a rather jet-lagged pre-lunch good morning, and I mentioned the jet lag because my jet lag usually determines the direction of my speech. So either gloomy, and very much depending also on the amount of schnapses I had last night at Danny Guttenberg's house, or optimistic. And trying to fit these two things together, I come to the conclusion the keynote today will be somehow gloom-timistic regarding the question how blockchain interrelates with geopolitics, as I think a highly underestimated viewpoint, although we have touched upon some of those issues already this morning in fascinating talks I had the pleasure to follow. But in some aspects, I probably have a very distinct opinion. So it was in 2011 when Mark Andreessen, a guy who can spell self-confidence correctly, obviously, came up with the infamous phrase, software is eating the world. And he connected that very notion to the development of 60 years of the computer, 40 years of microprocessing, 20 years at that point in 2011 of the modern internet. And he came to the conclusion that software actually has reached a level of global scale and of developing an impact where this kind of phrase actually made sense. It's eating the world. Today, some would say and mention, and we have heard the gentleman before me, artificial intelligence is eating software, is eating the world. Or it might even be artificial intelligence for some / blockchain is eating software, is eating the world. We could challenge that, but I would like to add another dimension which we don't think about enough, in my opinion, because it really fits into the overall question, how successful will new technologies be and how successful could and will blockchain be and cryptocurrencies. And that's something where I don't have a slide for, but just for the back of your head, I would add the sentence, the world has started to eat its quote-unquote software. And we're not meaning the technological software here. I'm meaning the software the world has developed over the last decades, probably centuries, even millennia. And we're talking here about its own systems, maybe democratic systems, maybe international systems. And it's also more and more beginning driven by a lot of the things you have discussed for the last 2 days to question international developments. And one has just to take this week. We see a highly worrisome development into renationalization. And I've heard the lovely and highly commendable ideas this morning about international standardization when it comes to blockchain, international cooperation regarding cryptocurrencies. But looking at the world right now, looking at the counter-movement we are seeing, looking at how renationalization is taking place and at what pace and what intensity, I have to say for the current moment, for right now, when it comes to international standardization, when it comes to the idea of bringing ideas together that go much further than just the national level, I'm sorry, dream on. It's not going to happen soon. And we have to take this dimension into account, as well as 2 other, I would say, fields of tension and already existing and potential conflict. I will come to it in a second. And also, when I traveled here, thought about another phenomenon where I tried to find a fitting analogy for, and I came up with the poorest analogy imaginable. When I was thinking about St. Moritz, the analogy is snow. You may think, snow? Snow. in tech, but in politics, we have, apart from the guy up there, only a few who are capable of creating snow. We have tons who pretend to be capable of skiing on top of that snow. And in tech, we have almost no one who has an idea that snow can create avalanches. In politics, every single one can create an avalanche, and they know it. And these two worlds are still apart from each other, but also somehow interconnected. And I come back to the avalanche analogy, also in respect of the two developments I try to describe now. So again, here with the avalanche, you have different scales, as we all know. And specifically in this area, and looking at the catastrophe we have seen in the Alps over the last few weeks, it seemed to be a fitting description. The first development I'd like to put your focus on is very much connected to my own experiences in my years of politics, and I'm still struggling with the description of my Swiss colleague who said it needs more winners in politics. I don't know whether I would see myself as a winner or a loser. I can only promise him politics only creates losers, and he might probably be one at one point as well. And then it's lovely to be back on the other side. But my experience there was that apart from the fact that as a politician you always pretend to be knowledgeable in fields where you're utterly clueless, and technology was for me one of those fields, although I was the Minister for Economics and Technology for a while. The other side is equally as clueless when it comes to the wider political spectrum, maybe domestically or maybe internationally. And fitting that to the development I currently see, it creates rather dramatic outcomes. And the development I once described a few years ago already as a move from government to quote-unquote Googlement. And Googlement stands as a proxy for large companies, the big players, the currently big players, who have not the responsibility for a nation, but a user base and an economy that resembles nations, whole countries, that stands for the influence it has on the way we communicate with each other, stands for subscribing, quote-unquote, citizens, 2.3 billion when it comes to Facebook. It stands for the year 2017, a revenue of Alphabet that was as high as the GDP of Morocco, of the Ukraine, or even Ecuador. Just to give you an idea what kind of influence they have assembled already. But at the same time, of course, we have, always at a slow pace, governments realizing something's happening here. Core elements of our systems are being questioned and taken away by those players, and they're redefining the power relationship between governments and the private and public sector as such, plus its citizens. And so far, we do not have a solution regarding the conflict scenarios that has produced, the avalanches it has produced. And we have seen a few. Some of them created by these guys, some of them created by politics, and some of them created by both interacting with each other, most of the time not in a very pleasant way. And I don't have to tell you all the examples, for instance, Facebook stands for the last 2 years. They have encountered quite a few avalanches. Some of them self-produced, some of them produced by others. Same is true for Google, a little bit more silent, but especially when it comes to the interaction with the European Union, a love affair. Same is true for Amazon. A couple have understood that they have to walk a little bit more silently. Microsoft is an example for that. but they're also constantly encountering avalanches. Google, and not only Google, but those big players are all the time confronted with privacy issues. Facebook is a core example for the bigotry, the geopolitical bigotry of social media, praised as the savior in the Middle East a few years ago, and then lovely players in the Middle East using that platform, or Twitter, or others, for their horrible causes. And again, a clash between the political spectrum here, an avalanche for those not reacting properly. And we are still far from what we actually need to resolve that kind of government to Googlement development, where we would probably have to talk about a new social contract between a still to be connected interaction, public-private sector hybrid, and the citizens, domestically and globally. It hasn't happened yet. So this is a field of tensions where we definitely need to be aware of. The second one is more, let's say, classically geopolitical, and we've heard already a couple of notions today about it. And that's the competition regarding three systems. And one system we could still call, but it's changing at the moment as well, you may call the American system, or the, let's say, somehow Western system. The second one is a growing and growingly important Chinese system. And we've heard already a couple of very important thoughts this morning by Michael Sung. And the third one is a we don't know where we actually stand system, where the European Union is the core example for it. Again, we might see two towering mountains, potentially creating avalanches against each other, but also against companies popping up in the respective spheres. And the European Union not really knowing whether they are a valley or also a little mountain or maybe a growing mountain, but somewhere in between. But when we come to the questions I've raised at the beginning, and we see these competing systems, and we see the geopolitical impact that competition has, also for all of your companies, we have to understand who within those competing systems is currently the leader when it comes to future standard setting, who will be the one gaining more and more, let's say, classical impact and power, very often connected to military power. And I'm afraid to say, it's not necessarily, the answer to the question is not necessarily tied to that jack in the box in the White House, but more and more to someone who has now formulated a global geopolitical strategy and who is sitting in Beijing. And the standards, when it comes to tech developments, when it comes to the question who will be the one phrasing the most impactful blockchain standards in the future, the standard setter could very well be China. And that's connected not to the question that they are still critical, very inward-looking, and yes, driven by the question what creates stability at home first, but that's tied to this new geopolitical strategy where I can always only recommend to you to read two speeches. One is a little Castro-esque, which was Xi Jinping's speech at the latest party convention, the 19th Communist Party Convention in Beijing, and the other one was the one he held towards a smitten audience not too far from here at Davos in 2017 when the blonde guy didn't pop up. He came a year later. And when the audience was hanging on Xi Jinping's lips and believing everything he said about free markets, free trade, but also not only in a hidden message, but a clear message, a new ambition of China formulated on the global stage. And they've been there already for a while. If you look at their influence they have in Africa, and specifically if you look now at the One Belt, One Road initiative, they are talking with these countries already very intensely about whether they'll be willing to adopt their ideas regarding tech regulation, regarding standards, regarding blockchain. And suddenly, you have, when it comes to the question of finding partners and allies for something newly drafted, suddenly you have 80 or 90 or 100 states following China. The US at the very moment does not do a lot to find allies, to put it mildly. Europe's not capable of doing so. So that leaves us with the necessity to freakingly understand what China is doing, for whatever business idea you may have in your head. And if you say, I don't care about China, because I try to develop my ideas in Africa or some developing countries, you better read the influence of China in those countries as well, before you try to circumvent something which you cannot circumvent any longer. So we need to see that too. Government, Googlement, and the field of tensions between 2, 2.5, maybe 3 systems. Maybe we see an entirely new one popping up at one point. Hard to grasp right now. Then we have to ask ourselves the question, well, that's a classical conflict. What does it have to do with blockchain? It's Facebook, it's Google, it's Amazon. You have to be aware that's already, the question I've just raised, that's already enough for 2 or 3 generations to grasp, specifically in the political circus. And then you guys popped up and said we have something entirely new here as well, which will also change the interrelation and the relationship between the private and the public sector and to its citizens. And you shouldn't be surprised that all the lawmakers are just overwhelmed by another topic which they just cannot understand properly. Again, they pretend to. I did that for a very long time. But again, they don't have a clue. So you've got to see that risk, because it creates just the next element of potential avalanches piling up around you. When we come to the geopolitical dimension, of course, we have to ask ourselves, what kind of impact will blockchain have? Is it an igniting factor, or is it maybe a pacifying factor? Could be both. But then we also have to distinguish what kind of blockchain we're talking about. And in theory, the most promising geopolitical blockchain idea would be tied to open ledgers as opposed to permissioned ledgers. But again, I can only say that's quite an illusion out of a few reasons. Yes, it is quite logical that if you look at that picture that you all know, that I think was originally brought up by Union Square Ventures, where they started talking about the fat protocol layer theory, that for a geopolitical spectrum, it is tempting to have comparatively attractive, easy access entry and a rather small manipulative layer on top. But on one hand, this equation will change at one point, more and more towards probably equal sizes. That's what I predict. I might be wrong. But on the other hand, when we talk about open ledgers, we still talk about major adaptation issues on the international level, major scalability issues. We still talk about also the likelihood of organized cyber attacks. And I come to that point because some will just feel threatened by the idea of an open ledger. And some would also say, well, We have to look at the restricted time periods of encryption algorithms, and so on and so on. That might be a minor point, but it could be a point. The most important factor for why this level is rather illusory for blockchain development on the international geopolitical impact level is, and that also translates into permissioned ledgers on the international level, is something which a friend of mine, Ian Bremmer, describes as the G0 world. And it resembles to what I've said before. What is it? It is a world where international cooperation is the least achievable thing. It is a world where the international system is seen by many scholars, but by also many practitioners, as an anarchy. And I know that some in this room present themselves proudly as anarchists. The international system is also, and I subscribe to that, and I have worked and lived long enough also as a defense minister in that realm, is anarchic. Why so? Because in this world, still, almost every single nation state doesn't put the international cooperation first, but its own zero-sum mentality. And the best exponent for that is the blonde guy on the other side of the Atlantic. But we see that in most of the European member states in the meantime as well. You may see the development in the UK also as an example for that. And as long as the technology cannot overcome a zero-sum mentality, and a mentality that sees its interests first, that is not willing to go further and say, let's share certain elements that are core and central to our power game. A true, impactful international role for blockchain will be hard to achieve. It's just some of the realities you have to see, and we have to face. So again, in theory, it sounds fantastic. And crypto maximalists would say, well, we need to achieve a cryptocurrency that stands alongside fiat currency. And we've heard about that yesterday. I kind of like that idea. But then again, you're talking about one of the last remaining elements of power that has not been taken away yet or challenged by the Googles and Facebooks and Amazons, going back from government to Googlement, that's still remaining there, and it's monetary policy. Do you really expect, specifically the major players, to wholeheartedly embrace the idea of giving that more or less away and putting themselves as a system at risk? And I haven't read and listened so far to a system that could be compelling for those players. So that's one of the things we have to see here as well. Another factor, of course, is still how undeveloped those ideas are. Some of them are at an interesting stage, but as long as a transaction via Bitcoin takes, or put it the other way around, as long as you can only do 7 transactions per second via Bitcoin, and Visa offers 65,000 per second, there's still some work to do to become convincing for a government to say, well, we're also willing to accept a payment system that outwits our ideas we've had so far, even if they may be archaic. And I can only promise you one thing: governments are utterly slow, not very often highly logical, but as soon as you reach the necessary pace, going up to 65K, for instance, then you will face an extremely fast reaction by a government. Whether it's logical or not, but it will come, and you better be prepared. So the international level is not easy, to reach as a first goal with blockchain ideas. The national level offers interesting fields of influence, and I've invested in a couple of them, and I see them with great interest, and they develop also quite properly, but they will also take time and a lot of convincing power, because they're also questioning some of those things politicians romantically and nostalgically look at. So on one hand, for instance, the idea to fight corruption with more transparency via blockchain regarding key financial issues, other things. I stay a little bit broader here. On the other hand, the idea to create vote protocols for healthy and clean elections. But you can only imagine there will be some countries who are not that eager to have the cleanest elections imaginable. There's a third idea which I wholeheartedly embrace, and that's using the blockchain for property rights. And yes, you could say they have an international dimension if they work. Yes, they do. And they could set an example where you could tie together all those elements. But that's still some way to go. But what I would always propose, even if you have the broad, the global, the big geopolitical idea, start domestically, start nationally, start to deal with those regulators first properly, and then you could come to better conclusions. And specifically, understand where the US is focusing at right now, where China is focusing at. And even if it may sound paradoxical what's happening at the moment in China, Michael Sung has described it very properly today. There's a lot of logic behind that. And the impact will be pretty high. There are one or two international elements that are promising, but again, they are facing already a lot of criticism, not noisily articulated by international bodies, but also by some of the countries that might be affected. And that's using blockchain on one hand for the whole refugee and migration issues. There are a lot of elements that are compelling. May it be that you could really follow the whole path of vaccines or of aid to outwit those who would always misuse developing aid coming to the country. 30%, according to a UN study, of the money that flows to those countries are still landing in the throat of corrupt organizations, and only 0.2% go directly. 0.2% go directly to local organizations that would disperse it. So there, blockchain could be extremely helpful. But again, you're dealing with organizations and people and politicians with their own vanities. So start reading them early enough before you start rolling out your initiative here. And therefore, to avoid avalanches for your business, for your investments, also for my investments, I can only ask you to have people around you. It's the opposite of what I tell politicians and also, let's say, old-style companies, the old industry, whom I say, have young techies around you, have people who challenge you the whole time, who give you an idea where this world could be moving to, and where you finally get to some thinking. I would ask you to have someone around you who translates to you the potential political and geopolitical risks you might be exposed to, who is capable of digging deep into the snow and gathering, is there an avalanche risk, yes or no? Because at the end of the day, you really, 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 really don't want to be that guy down there. So for that, gloom-optimistic, I lead you to the awesome lunch we have been promised. But I thought that notion was necessary because we hear a lot of enthusiasm here. I am an enthusiastic investor and advisor in this world as well. But be aware of risk factors. The guys who drive you into certain investments wouldn't tell you. Thank you.